One interesting thing about inclusion in the workplace is that even though you're not doing anything to intentionally exclude people within your team, it still does not necessarily mean that you're being as inclusive as you should be. Inclusion is a marathon, not a sprint. And so there's always something to do better and better. If you work within a team, come closer. Let me share 4 inclusion mistakes that you should no longer make within your team. If you're here for the first time, welcome! I am Ola, your DI bestie, and I help organizations and inclusive leaders ensure that they get the best out of their employees and that their organizations function at the highest level of innovation, productivity, and inclusion, especially by championing a strong sense of belonging in the workplace. So the topic of the day, 4 inclusion mistakes that you're making within your team. The first inclusion mistake that you just might be making within your team is treating everyone equally. Now, equality is not a bad thing, but it is different from equity. While equality focuses on sameness, treating everyone the same, giving everyone the same access, the same resources. Look at equity as meeting every individual at the point of their unique needs. So for instance, when it comes to recognition within your team, some people prefer to be praised publicly. Others prefer private praises. And actually, some people don't even want to be praised. One of my direct reports once told me she doesn't really care for being praised. She wants those praises to be reflected in salary increases, tangible benefits, and maybe even promotions. So learning what your teammates and your colleagues really prefer is the way to go. Also, when it comes to different kinds of allowances, different kinds of considerations in the workplace, when it comes to ways of working, whether remote work, in-person work, as much as the situation allows, it's important to confer with people and see what they prefer in order to include them more. People also have different preferences and people have different circumstances. You have working moms in the workplace, you have working parents, caregivers generally in the workplace, and sometimes what works for one person would not work for another person. So inclusion is doing the work of finding out everyone's unique needs and actually supporting them to be their best in the workplace and on your team. The second inclusion mistake that you just might be making is not taking cognizance of cultural differences within your team. This is a very big one, a very important one actually. We have to realize that even though everyone is really unique with their unique ways of behavior, ways of seeing the world, culture also influences how we show up in certain spaces, what our preferences are, how we do things, how we just view the world and view others. For instance, one good example of how culture can influence how people show up in the workplace is the significance of eye contact, gestures, and just personal space amongst different cultures. So in a Western culture, for instance, the US, people might infer that holding eye contact for a prolonged period of time signifies confidence, right? However, when you go to the more Middle Eastern cultures, holding eye contact can actually be seen as being defiant, right? So the same thing, eye contact, can be interpreted in different ways across different cultures. That applies to giving people pecks on the cheek, hugging people, acknowledging that these differences exist, and understanding people's behaviors and gestures through the lens of cultural differences could help you include people and their modes of behavior better. Another example is communication. Some cultures prefer a more direct form of communication, being crisp, being clear, being direct in what you're saying without cutting corners, right? So the Dutch are very famous for being very direct communicators. And indirect communication is what is favored in some cultures. Like in the Nigerian culture, for instance, indirect communication is more favored. Maybe even some parts of British culture can favor more indirect communication, because such cultures believe that indirect communication preserves the peace, creates harmony, and all of that. So recognizing that some of your colleagues might have different communication styles influenced by culture is really important. When I moved to the Netherlands, I actually got off on the wrong foot with one of my colleagues because I received feedback from her for the first time, and it was so direct and so brutal that I was very put off, and I had to have a conversation with my manager, with the colleague in question as well, to really understand how she communicates and also how I am used to communication so that we could find a middle ground. Very, very important to acknowledge that. And even when it comes to culture around timekeeping, time management, meeting schedules, sticking to timelines, some cultures are more flexible than others. So for instance, the Latin American culture, the African culture, these cultures prefer or lean more towards relationship building, ensuring that everyone works in consensus, everyone is on the same page. That is more of a priority to them than sticking to schedules and keeping to time on the minute, just like some cultures like the Germans and the Dutch are, quite known for that. So it's important to really understand these cultural differences and how they might influence the ways that people show up and behave at work. The third inclusion mistake that you just might be making on your team is assuming that silence means agreement. Silence is a very loaded response. So when you're in a meeting with your team members, you make a suggestion or someone makes a suggestion and everybody is silent, it doesn't mean that everybody is in agreement. It might mean very different things. So for instance, people might not be comfortable with dissenting, maybe because there is very little trust within the team, or they just don't feel safe to dissent at that point. Also, the fact that people are very loud and very vocal during a meeting doesn't mean that they're the only ones who have something to contribute. People can have something to contribute and be silent, maybe because the meeting setting doesn't work for them to make their contribution. And that's why it's important within your team to create various avenues for giving feedback. You can create opportunities for giving feedback in writing, opportunities for giving feedback during one-to-ones when everyone on the team is not present, just to accommodate people who might prefer other modes of communication more than speaking. You can also ensure that you call on specific individuals for their contributions, especially people who might be quiet. And it doesn't mean, putting them on the spot. It might be just a gentle way of drawing them in. Cecilia, you really have good thoughts about this part of our work the last time. You really always have good ideas when it comes to marketing. Do you have something to contribute to this? Please feel free to share if you do. Just gently drawing people in when you see that they are a bit quieter than the rest of the team. And even just doing a round when you need contributions, not asking for volunteers, but really just going round the room or around the table or around the screen for people to contribute, for people to have dedicated times for individual contribution. That can be a really powerful way to draw people in and ensure that you're not just assuming everyone is in agreement because they're silent. The fourth inclusion mistake that you just might be making within your team is not minding the equal distribution of office housework and office glamour work. This is another important one, and one that has gained a lot of attention over the years. Office housework refers to the more mundane, administrative, less valued aspects of work in the office or in the workplace. So for instance, planning lunch, writing down the minutes and circulating them, booking rooms, working on, the more routine and less valued streams of work within the team. Meanwhile, office glamour work is the exact opposite. It's work that really gets you noticed and promoted, like making big presentations, representing your team or representing the entire organization at a summit or an important meeting or conference, really working with the big, well-known, very valued clients, those kinds of work that are huge milestones in your career. And we see from studies that office housework and office glamour work are not usually distributed equally. In fact, I came across a study that 30% of women are less likely to do office glamour work, while 30% of women are also more likely to do office housework. And it's important within your team to check that there is an equal distribution of both office housework and office glamour work. A good practice is to outsource as much as possible office housework. Where it's not possible to outsource office housework, a good practice is also to rotate it, have some form of formal or informal rota to ensure that no one within the team is overdoing or underdoing office housework, regardless of their position and their authority. A good practice to redistribute office glamour work is also to ensure that people are getting the requisite training that they need within the team. One excuse that people often give for concentrating office glamour work on a few colleagues or a few teammates is that they're the ones who are more qualified to show up in those capacities. It's a call to really train and capacitate everyone within your team to ensure that they can equally take on office glamour work. I hope this has been very helpful for you. If you can relate to any one of these mistakes, maybe you've committed one of them in the past, or you just can relate to them, please let me know in the comment section. See you in the next video.